I'm a big fan of 4 cylinders, but if there's one place they don't belong, it's under the hood of a muscle car.
And normally I would agree with Dan. I'm a huge fan of V8s, but the Ecoboost you can get in this Mustang has more going for it than you might think. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love big, angry muscle cars like the Mustang GT, but if you're in the market for a sports car and fuel economy is even a tiny concern, this Ecoboost engine is the one to get. And plus, it's not hurting that much for power either. So this Mustang is powered by a 2.3-liter 4-cylinder engine that's turbocharged. It puts out 310 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque, but because this has the performance pack, output is actually bumped up to 330 horsepower. And yes, that's a far cry away from the GT, but it still gives this car plenty of personality.
I have to agree with Jodi on one thing, those numbers can't touch this Mustang GT. I'm packing 460 horsepower and 420 pound-feet of torque, which is as ridiculous as it sounds, and it is crazy to me that you're getting those numbers from the base V8. Yes, I know the Chevy Camaro SS is about the same, but it's crazy to me how close it is to something like the specialized Dodge Challenger SRT 392. Just like that Ecoboost car, this one has the performance pack too, but there's no bump in output here. But you do get a bigger rad, as well as some extra chassis bracing and tuning, and some upgraded suspension components. And then this one also has adaptive dampers and an active exhaust system. And that exhaust really hammers home the point of just how intense this car is. Now, there are some quieter versions, but most of them are pretty loud to begin with. And besides, I really think that's how a car like this is best enjoyed. I mean, just listen to that. I can't get enough of it. Yes, the Mustang has come a long way over the years, and it's way more sports car than muscle car these days, but this Coyote V8 is still a proper muscle car motor, and I love it. It's got tons of progressive torque, but it really likes to hang out right around that 4,800 RPM mark. That's where it really comes alive and gives you that full thrust. And again, having that active rev match is just awesome.
It makes me feel so freaking cool. So this Ecoboost Mustang is definitely the tamer of the two cars, and that's not just because it has less power, it just feels a lot more mellow and relaxed. So whenever I get into the Mustang GT, I just turn into a huge jerk. Just how fast I drive, how aggressive I am, how much noise I make. It's just egging me on all the time. But in this Ecoboost Mustang, it's a lot more chill, which is actually really good news for old Leadfoot Jones over here. So obviously the automatic transmission in this Ecoboost plays a role in how relaxed it feels. And this one has the 10-speed automatic, which is a great transmission. It's responsive and it's mostly good, except sometimes in sport mode, there's a couple jerky shifts and it'll be confused sometimes, but it's only happened a couple times, so it's not a big concern. If this Ecoboost Mustang came with a 6-speed manual, it would just be perfection, and it would really increase how engaged I feel with the car and how much more fun it could be. So this Ecoboost Mustang has a lot of the same features as that GT. So it has the performance pack, it has an active exhaust, and it has adaptive dampers. And even with all of those same features, these two cars feel like completely different animals. So one of the reasons I actually enjoy the Ecoboost more is that it feels so much more agile than the GT. Even with the automatic transmission, this Ecoboost weighs about 300 pounds less than the GT, and you can feel every single one of those pounds in that car. This one feels a lot less nose heavy, and it's so much easier to place where you want it. It's just so much fun in a winding road, and it's very easy and approachable to drive, which is why I love it so much.
Obviously, the biggest improvement to the Mustang over the years has been this 6th gen version finally getting an independent rear suspension. But you know, it does still have some of that old school vibe, again, with this V8 engine under the hood. And I think it hits that perfect balance of something more modern like the Chevy Camaro and an old school car like the Challenger. Now, as you can see, this one's got a 6-speed manual gearbox too, and it is absolutely perfect. There's a great feel to this shifter, and the clutch has incredible action. It's very forgiving, but it also gives you a ton of feel, which comes in handy when you're rowing your own gears. There's also an auto rev match function if you have a hard time with the heel and toe downshift, but it's pretty easy to turn it off through this gauge cluster if you can do it yourself. I personally like it because it can do things way better than any human can, so my suggestion is to leave it on and let the computer do its thing, but you can turn it off if you prefer. Ford really deserves some credit for making how you interface with all the different settings in this thing so incredibly simple. You've got some buttons here on the steering wheel to cycle through different stuff, and then you have these toggle switches up here in front of the shifter so you can change things like your steering feel, your drive modes, or your traction control. It's really awesome just how approachable and user-friendly this whole cabin is, and that includes this infotainment system, though it is a little outdated, and Apple CarPlay and Android Auto do feel like a bit of an afterthought.
If I have one complaint about the Mustang's driving dynamics, it is the steering. So steering has never been a really strong suit of any Mustang, and that's true whether you're talking about the Ecoboost or the GT. It just feels a little bit artificial, and for a sports car, I think it should have a lot more resistance and a lot more weight to it, and even in sport mode, it still feels a little bit too soft. So you can also switch between a whole bunch of different drive settings, anything from comfort to track to drag race mode. There's even a snow and wet mode, and you can even mix and match some of the settings and individualize your own one. Also, if you go with the active exhaust, you can toggle between different modes that progressively get louder as you go, so it really depends on how much fun you want to have. So I was actually really surprised by how the Ecoboost sounds. So I went into this review thinking and assuming that it would sound like crap, but that's actually not the case. I was really surprised when I got in, and it actually sounded pretty good. And at first I was convinced it was artificial noise being piped into the cabin through the speakers, which is generally a no bueno for sports car enthusiasts. But when I was driving the GT and Dan was in the Ecoboost in front of me, he just took off and he let it rip. And it actually sounded pretty good, so I was really surprised. Now, I will say that I do miss the loud, angry rumbling of that V8. It just sounds so good, but it's always egging you on to break the law, and you just don't get that vibe in the Ecoboost, which is actually good news.
I just can't get into the way that thing sounds, and to me it doesn't suit the Mustang at all, and it really drones on the highway, especially when you go to pass someone. Even in the quiet mode, I don't like it at all. Then again, on the flip side, this thing is really loud with the baffles open, though it's cool that you can do stuff like set it to a silent start to keep your neighbors happy.
As far as what they're like to live with every day, as we have them, they're pretty different, but you can actually get a lot of the same options between the two of them. So that means if you want these sporty red Recaro seats in the Ecoboost, you can do that. And these seats are really supposed to channel that racing vibe, which is cool, but the downside of that means that they're not heated and they're not ventilated, everything is manual. And that's not great news considering the price tag of this car. And it is weird for Ford not to offer those things because other automakers have sporty Recaros that are heated and ventilated, so why can't Ford? So I actually really like these sporty Recaros. The bolstering on them is very aggressive, and so I fit nice and snug when I'm going around twisty roads. Dan is a bit larger than me, so he finds it a little bit less comfortable, but I found it really easy to find a good driving position in either Mustang. All in all, this Mustang GT feels like a real driver's car, and that's perfect because that is exactly what it's supposed to do. If I had a nit to pick about the Mustang's interior, it's that the infotainment touchscreen can be a little bit laggy and slow to respond sometimes, and it is weird that you don't have a hard button for something like the heated steering wheel.
I'm with Jodi in that I really wish this one had a manual transmission too, but I have to admit that it's pretty fun to toss this thing around. And I think this is gonna appeal to a lot of people because it doesn't feel as prone to step out sideways on you when you really get on the gas. No, it doesn't have as much output as that V8 version, but this thing still has 350 pound-feet of torque, which is way more than Mustangs passed with V8 engines. That is a lot of torque, and you can really feel it when you step on the throttle. That really does feel like the ideal amount of output for the way this particular chassis is set up, and that includes all of those suspension upgrades that Ford has thrown at this thing. And really, if I had one complaint about this car, it would come back to this 10-speed automatic transmission. And these paddles in particular, because they just don't feel like they're really ready to respond as quickly as I would like, especially on downshifts, which can be a big problem when you're tossing this thing into a corner and you hit that paddle on the left side of the steering wheel. You want it to respond right away and spike the revs to give you that engine braking, and it just doesn't do it every time. But otherwise, this Mustang Ecoboost really is an excellent alternative to something like, say, the Subaru BRZ or Mazda MX-5, with the added bonuses of way more room and power.
So Ford has really positioned the Ecoboost Mustang as a competitor to those cars that Dan had mentioned earlier in terms of price. And I know a lot of people will end up spending more on their Mustangs, but you can get into a base one for about 31 grand before taxes and fees, while the cheapest Mustang GT starts at about 10,000 bucks more than that. So there really is quite the difference between the two in terms of price.
Now, both of these are the premium trims, so they start at about 7 grand each, more than the base versions before you start to add extras, and there are plenty of extras on these cars we're driving. If you're looking at this one in particular, it's 55 grand before tax, and that GT Jodi's driving is 66,000 bucks. But then again, there are probably a ton of incentives you can get to bring the price down into more reasonable territory. To recap, we like the unique personality of the Mustang Ecoboost, as well as how nimble it is to drive and how much output the 2.3 liter generates. We don't like the 10-speed automatic transmission or the infotainment system, and I'm not especially fond of the exhaust note.
When it comes to the Mustang GT, we like the raw power of the 5-liter V8, the way the 6-speed manual feels, and that it still feels like an old-school muscle car. We don't like that you can't get the sport seats with heat and ventilation, how much more expensive it is than the Ecoboost version, or that it's got the same outdated infotainment interface. Going into this comparison, I thought that there was no way an automatic Ecoboost could sway me over a manual V8, but I really was impressed with the way that 4-cylinder Mustang comes together as a usable sports car.
I'm still a huge fan of that 5-liter, but I have to admit to being pretty impressed with how this Turbo 4 comes together in this package.
And there's really no wrong choice between the two, but if you're one of those people who thinks that there's no replacement for displacement, then the GT is the only way to go.
I really think this 4-cylinder is going to surprise a lot of you out there. No, it's not quite as fast as the GT in a straight line, but it's a capable sports car in its own right, and it's plenty of fun when the road starts to wind.